Someone said something to you recently, something ordinary, maybe a complaint you've heard 100 times before, or a piece of advice you didn't ask for, or a joke that landed wrong because it wasn't actually a joke. And instead of smiling through it the way you always have, you just couldn't. The patience wasn't there. There was nothing to reach for. And afterward, the guilt arrived right on schedule, because you used to be better at this. I want to talk to you about that moment. Not to tell you to be kinder and not to excuse anything. I want to look at what that moment actually is, because Carl Jung spent a significant part of his clinical life documenting it. And what he found is not what most people expect when they start down this road. Before we go further, if this kind of investigation is useful to you, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely matters to the algorithm, and it's what allows me to keep digging through this material and bringing it here. I read what you write in the comments. I don't take that lightly, and I'm grateful for every person who stays. Now, let's start with what everyone believes. The image most people carry when they first encounter the idea of spiritual awakening is one of expansion, increasing softness, the development of a kind of bottomless compassion, the patient elder, unruffled, equanimous, able to sit with anyone and anything without disturbance. If you are truly on the path, the story goes, you become more tolerant over time, more understanding. You begin to see the suffering beneath the behavior. You hold space without effort. You do not snap. You certainly do not find yourself driving home from a family dinner, wondering why you even went, counting the minutes until you were back in your own silence. This image is so deeply embedded in how awakening gets described, in books, in communities, in the casual shorthand of the culture, that when the opposite begins to happen, the natural conclusion is that something has gone wrong, that you have taken a wrong turn, that the spiritual work has somehow made you worse, not better, that the version of you who snapped at someone last Tuesday is the proof. The people I've encountered over the years who were working through this described it in ways that are remarkably consistent with one another. One person said it felt like a physical tightening in her chest every time certain conversations started, a bracing, like a hand on the sternum, before the other person had even finished their first sentence. Another described it as a kind of sudden deafness, not anger exactly, but an inability to continue tracking what was being said, as though the signal had simply dropped and she was watching lips move without hearing sound. Someone else told me he started declining invitations, not because he was depressed or antisocial, but because the prospect of certain interactions now registered in his body the way a bad meal registers, a preemptive recoil before the thing even happened. That last detail matters more than it might seem. The body as a witness. We'll come back to it properly later, because what the body is doing during this period is one of the more unsettling and under-discussed dimensions of what Jung was describing. But here's where the story turns. Because if you actually go back and read Jung, not the quotes on motivational posters, not the softened summaries in introductory textbooks, but the actual clinical records and letters and his own accounts of his patients' processes, you find something that contradicts the expansion narrative entirely. Jung documented across multiple decades of practice that the individuation process does not produce a person who can tolerate everything. It produces, with striking consistency, a person who can no longer tolerate certain things they previously tolerated only through suppression. That distinction is everything. Everything turns on it. In 1921, in Psychological Types, Jung described the persona as a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. The persona is the mask we construct, not out of dishonesty, necessarily, but out of adaptation. We learn early what makes us acceptable, what gets approval, what keeps the room comfortable and the relationships intact and the family dinner manageable. And we build a face accordingly. Most of us are so fluent in wearing that face by adulthood that we've forgotten we put it on at all. The persona doesn't feel like a mask by 40. It feels like skin. The persona is not a lie. It's a tool. It is the mechanism that allows us to function in the first half of life, to hold a job, to maintain relationships, to navigate the enormous complexity of social existence without constant friction. And for most of the first half of life, it works. But there is a cost to every adaptation. When you wear the face long enough, the things that face concealed don't go away. They go inward, they accumulate, they grow strange in the dark. Jung called this accumulated material the shadow, not evil, not monstrous, nothing as dramatic as those words suggest, but simply the repository of everything the persona couldn't afford to express. The irritation you swallowed at the dinner table in 1997. The boundary you didn't draw because drawing it would have made things complicated. The honest response you replaced with a smile because the smile was so much easier for everyone involved. The friendship you maintained long past the point where it stopped being mutual because the alternative was a conversation you didn't know how to have. All of it, somewhere, waiting. And here is the first thing that doesn't fit the official story. In Ion, published in 1951, Jung wrote that everything that irritates us in others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, often signaling a confrontation with the shadow, meaning the intolerance you feel when someone else talks too long, performs too hard, complains in circles without wanting resolution, or asks you to pretend that irritation is not really about them. It is the shadow surfacing. It is the accumulated weight of every time you perform the exact same thing you can no longer stand watching performed at you. This is not comfortable material, but stay with it for a moment. Because this is where the investigation gets precise, and the precision is what makes it useful rather than just interesting. The impatience you feel after an awakening is not new. It was always there. What is new is that the persona, the part of you that knew how to manage it, suppress it, reroute it into polite engagement or patient listening or productive redirection, has begun to fail. Not because you've become a worse person, because the adaptive function that once sustained the performance has started breaking down under a weight it was never designed to carry indefinitely. The structure is failing because it was always a temporary structure. Jung was very clear that the persona is a first half of life tool. What the second half requires is something different entirely. I spent 32 years drawing editorial portraits, ink and paper mostly, book covers, some portrait engravings, the kind of work that requires you to take someone's face and render it in a way that is both recognizably them and also somehow an argument about who they are. Because a cover is not a photograph, it is a claim. And there is a particular kind of failure I encountered so often in that work that it became almost a reliable sign that something important was about to happen. You are working on a face. Commission deadline, client expectations clearly communicated, reference image approved. And something isn't working. You add more detail. You adjust the angle of the light. You go back to the reference and start again. You tell yourself it's technically correct, and it is. And yet, the face looks like a negotiation. It looks like the face the brief asked for, rather than the face you actually see when you look at it. The two things are not the same thing, and usually I could keep that uncomfortable fact at bay through enough technical concentration. But at some point in the process, every time the two things stop being separable, the failure isn't in the ink. The failure is that you stopped seeing clearly somewhere in the middle of the work and started drawing what you were supposed to deliver instead of what was actually there. And there comes a moment, I cannot explain this technically, only from the experience of it, when continuing in that direction becomes physically impossible. Not difficult, impossible. The hand simply refuses. The eye stops pretending the drawing is fine. The entire system that allowed you to produce acceptable work while half blind to what you actually saw just stops cooperating. The body refuses before the mind makes the decision. That moment always felt like failure. It was always, without exception, the opposite of failure. Because the only path forward from that moment was to draw what I actually saw. And what I actually saw was almost always more interesting, more specific, more alive than the negotiated version I had been working toward. The work that came after that refusal, after the hand stopped, was always truer. Not always what the client wanted immediately, but the ones that got framed and kept were always from that category. The persona breaking down in the middle of a conversation, or a relationship, or a family gathering works exactly the same way. It is not failure. It is the system that allowed you to function while suppressing what you actually perceived, finally reaching capacity. The patience runs out, not because you have become a colder person, but because the mechanism that manufactured patience from something that was never genuinely felt has reached its structural limit. The hand is refusing. The I has stopped pretending. This is what Jung meant by the individuation process, not producing infinite tolerance. It produces instead the collapse of performed tolerance. And those are radically different things, with radically different implications. Now, this is the point where I need to be precise about something, because the investigation has to go both directions if it's going to be honest. And I think it needs to be honest. There is a study published in 2020 by two researchers at Utrecht University, Roos Vonk and Anouk Visser, titled Spiritual Superiority, The Dark Side of Spiritual Development. It is an empirical paper. They surveyed several thousand people who identified as spiritually developed across a range of traditions and communities, and they found clear evidence of what they called a narcissistic inflation that masks itself as discernment. People who believed they were individuating, becoming more themselves, shedding the performance, were sometimes, the data showed, simply constructing a more sophisticated version of the persona, one that now identified as spiritually superior rather than merely socially acceptable. This matters, not as a warning to dismiss what you're feeling, but as a necessary precision tool, because it is possible to mistake ego fortification for ego dissolution. It is possible to call contempt discernment, to call avoidance growth, to call impatience wisdom. The study found specific markers that distinguish authentic individuation from what the researchers named spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual concepts to avoid genuine emotional work. And those markers are worth knowing because both states feel the same from the inside. The marker of genuine development is not the intolerance itself. It is what the intolerance is directed at. If the impatience is directed at behaviors and patterns, at superficial performance, at circular complaint that seeks no resolution, at conversations that ask you to maintain a pretense you can no longer sustain, that is the dissolving persona. The mask is coming off. What was suppressed is surfacing. The hand is refusing. But if the impatience is directed at people as people, if the underlying structure is I am more awake than they are, and my awakening excuses me from ordinary patience and consideration, that is not individuation. That is the old ego wearing new clothes. It is the persona reconstructing itself around a different identity, one that feels more evolved but is doing the same work, keeping the real self at a distance by hiding behind a performance. Both feel the same from the inside. The Vonk and Visser study was precise about this. Spiritual superiority produces a state that is phenomenologically identical to discernment. The person experiencing it cannot distinguish between the two through introspection alone. The distinction is behavioral. Jung drew this line clearly, and it is not abstract. He wrote about the difference between passive endurance, absorbing the unconscious behavior of others without limit, which over time produces resentment, distance, the specific bitterness of someone who has given without boundary for so long that the giving has curdled, and active equanimity, which is the capacity to remain present without being consumed. The first produces the people-pleasing persona. The second requires actual boundaries, and it requires something harder than boundaries, the willingness to be honest about what you are not able to give, rather than performing the giving and resenting the recipient for receiving it. What the person in genuine awakening is losing is not their compassion. They are losing their capacity to pretend a boundary doesn't exist. The compassion is still there. It is the performance that is ending. Here is the part that was buried. The physical dimension of this shift, the body as witness, is documented outside of psychology, and it is more unsettling in a certain way than the theoretical framework, because theory can be argued with. The body cannot. Across communities of people working through this kind of transition, in forums, in clinical accounts, in the kind of careful disclosure that happens when people feel safe enough to mention something that sounds strange, there is a recurring and quietly astonishing pattern. The psychological intolerance for superficiality that accompanies awakening is almost always accompanied by unexpected physical intolerances. Foods that were completely fine suddenly register as wrong. The glass of wine that used to smooth the edges of a difficult evening now just makes things worse, louder, more grating, less manageable. Coffee that was a morning ritual for 20 years becomes, seemingly overnight, too much, producing anxiety where it used to produce clarity. Certain environments that registered as neutral become genuinely difficult to remain in. Too loud, too bright, too dense with unprocessed energy. This is not metaphysical, or it doesn't have to be framed metaphysically to carry significance. What the pattern suggests is that the system renegotiating what it can accommodate is not only psychological. The body appears to be doing the same thing the psyche is doing, shedding what it was tolerating through compensatory structures that have now lost their capacity to compensate. The tolerance for these things was not genuine tolerance. It was managed suppression. When the management system starts failing, when the persona begins to dissolve, the manufactured tolerance disappears sometimes at every register simultaneously. The person who quit drinking during the same month they found certain conversations unbearable is not going through two separate adjustments. They may be going through one thing at different levels of the same system. Marion Woodman, who spent her clinical career working at precisely this intersection of body and psyche, would have recognized this pattern immediately. She argued consistently that the body does not lie. It does not maintain a polite fiction. It registers what the psyche has been trained to suppress, and when the suppression begins to fail, the body's record becomes visible. The physical intolerances are the body's contribution to the same surfacing truth that the psyche is producing in the form of impatience and contracting social energy. I find that remarkable, and I think Jung would too, though he would have framed it in terms of the compensatory dynamic between the conscious and unconscious systems. When the unconscious begins to surface in force, the compensations that held the old balance collapse across multiple dimensions at once. Now we reach the part that I think is most important, and it is where I want to be careful, because the investigation has brought us to a place that requires precision, not philosophy. The Academy of Ideas, in their documentation of the individuation process, described the inevitable intolerance phase this way. True individuation requires separating from the herd mentality, which inevitably leads to a period of feeling deeply intolerant of the superficial collective norms. They were specific, a period, a passage, not a permanent personality transformation, not a final state, not who you are becoming, but a phase of the becoming, like the disorientation that comes when you exit a building you've been inside for a long time. The light is too bright, the sounds are too close. Everything feels overstimulating in a way it didn't before. That is not your new relationship with light. That is the adjustment. This matters enormously if you are in the middle of it now, because the grief of this phase is real. The loneliness is real, and it deserves to be named rather than spiritually bypassed into a concept. You have lost something. You have lost the comfortable pretense that certain relationships were something they weren't, that they were nourishing when they were in fact draining, that the conversations were real when they were in fact performed, that the version of you who smiled through everything was the authentic one. That loss is not trivial, and the grief that comes with it is not weakness. It is the appropriate response to a genuine ending, and it is a loss you were always heading toward. The persona was always temporary. The people-pleasing adaptation was always on borrowed time, because it was built to serve a developmental phase, not a life. What feels like losing patience is actually losing the performance of patience. The substitution of genuine tolerance for an imitation that you produced for so long you forgot it was an imitation. What the imitation cost you is what you are starting to count now, and the counting is not comfortable. Robert A. Johnson, who spent decades translating Jung's clinical concepts into language that people could actually use in their ordinary lives, wrote that the person who begins to own their shadow, which is what individuation requires, at its foundation, will inevitably become more difficult to be around for people who are invested in everyone around them remaining adapted and predictable. Not because the individuating person becomes cruel or withholding, because they become real. And reality, the specific, unperformed, particular reality of a person who has stopped managing their self-presentation to preserve everyone else's comfort, is genuinely incompatible with certain relationships that were built entirely on mutual adaptation. That is not your failure. That is the process working. James Hillman made a related observation that I keep returning to because it reframes the loneliness of this phase in a way I find accurate and honest. He described the psyche's move away from persona as a move toward what he called the imaginal, the deeper life of image and meaning that exists beneath social performance, beneath the ordinary consensus reality of the dinner table and the workplace and the group chat. And he was specific that this move is experienced by the people around you as withdrawal, as coldness, as having somehow become less available, less easy, less kind. It is not less kind, it is more honest. And honesty at that depth is sometimes genuinely indistinguishable from unkindness to someone who needed the performance to continue. Not because they are malicious, but because the performance was load-bearing for them in ways that are now visible. When you stop holding up your end of a shared pretense, the other person feels the weight shift. They are not wrong to feel it. You are not wrong to put it down. Thomas More, in Care of the Soul, wrote that the soul requires something that ordinary social life consistently refuses to give it: specificity. Not general acceptance, not diplomatic tolerance that hovers above the particular, but the specific and particular truth of the present moment. What is actually here between these two people in this conversation right now? The soul, when it begins to demand that specificity, becomes intolerant of substitutes. Not because it has grown hard, because it has grown precise. Precision is not cruelty, but it is sometimes received as cruelty by those who preferred the generality. Clarissa Pinkola Estes described something adjacent when she wrote about the wild instinctual self, the part of the psyche that does not adapt, does not perform, does not smooth its edges to fit the available space. She argued that much of what gets called psychological illness in women, and, I would add, in anyone socialized toward excessive accommodation, is actually the suppression of this instinctual knowing, the anger that arrives without an acceptable reason, the exhaustion that has no medical cause, the inability to pretend. These, she argued, are not symptoms of dysfunction. They are the instinctual self attempting to restore the truth that the adapted self was covering. Anthony Stevens, writing about Jung's framework from an evolutionary perspective, added a dimension that I find clarifying rather than reductive. The human capacity for persona construction is adaptive at the species level. We are built for it. Social cohesion across large groups depends on individuals modulating their authentic responses to maintain collective harmony. The persona is not a Jungian invention. It is a biological feature shaped over tens of thousands of years of communal living that allows people who would otherwise be in constant conflict to coexist productively. But the second half of life, Stevens argues, following Jung closely here, requires the gradual reclamation of what was surrendered to that adaptation. Not its wholesale rejection. The person who abandons all social sensitivity is not individuated. They are simply a different kind of lost. But it's renegotiation, the discovery of where you actually end and where the performance begins. And that renegotiation is precisely what registers as impatience from the outside, and as a kind of devastating clarity from the inside. And all of it, the impatience, the physical reset, the contracting circle of comfortable relationships, the loneliness of no longer being able to pretend, points toward the same underlying event. The self is beginning to insist on being real, and it is doing this after what may have been decades of not being allowed to. That insistence is not always graceful. It is frequently uncomfortable for everyone involved. It produces endings and awkward silences and conversations that don't land, and the specific loneliness of being in a room full of people and feeling entirely elsewhere. But it is not regression. It is not cruelty. It is not evidence that you have become a worse person. It is evidence that the performance is ending. And here is what I want you to actually keep, because it is not a philosophy. It is a practice. It is the behavioral translation of everything we've just covered, and it's the difference between a genuinely different life and a more sophisticated cage. The question that distinguishes real discernment from spiritual arrogance is not whether you feel impatient. That is almost beside the point. The question is what you do with the impatience. Contempt, the version that says, I am past this and past you, the version that requires the other person to be inferior in order for your distance to feel justified, is the ego finding a more evolved performance to hide behind. It is the persona reconstructing itself around the identity of the awakened person, and it is just as much a mask as the people-pleasing version that preceded it. It will produce a different kind of loneliness, the same kind of suppression, the same eventual failure. Discernment, the version that actually produces something different, looks much more specific and much less dramatic. It looks like noticing that a particular conversation genuinely drains you, and ending it without requiring the other person to be condemned for it. It looks like saying, honestly, I don't want to talk about this right now, instead of talking about it while somewhere else in your mind. It looks like declining the invitation without the hour of guilt afterward, because the guilt was always just the persona insisting you should have stayed and performed better. It looks like allowing certain relationships to find their actual level, which may be less intimate than they were, or less frequent, or simply more honest about what they are, without requiring them to be failures. The drawing that comes after the hand refuses is not the drawing that satisfies the brief immediately, but it is the one that has a face in it, a real one, specific and alive and unable to be what it isn't. That is what you are working toward, not the performance of awakening, not a more impressive version of the adapted self, but the version of you that can no longer be what it isn't and is learning, slowly and with some awkwardness, what it actually is. The impatience is not the destination, but it is, right now, honest. And honest is where it starts. Before I leave you here, I want to know which part of this actually landed. Write it in the comments. Was it the physical dimension, the body resetting alongside the psyche, the foods and the sleep and the environments? Was it the distinction between contempt and discernment, that one is the old ego in new clothes and the other requires something harder? Or was it the simpler recognition that the patience you lost wasn't really patience at all? It was performance, and the performance is finally, honestly, over. I read everything you write down there. This channel is young and the community is small, which means I can actually do that, and it matters to me what you find here. I'll see you in the next one.